Okay, today we are going to look at contextualization and causation for the 19th century. So if we go to our course description, the first section of Unit 6 deals with contextualization. And again, contextualization, we should examine change from and or continuity with preceding historical developments, or similarities and or differences with contemporaneous historical developments in different regions or geographical areas. So for our DBQ introductory paragraphs, I think it's a lot better, easier, smarter to do the change in continuity from preceding historical developments. And of course, this is going to make a ton of sense with this particular unit. The big feature we talked about in Unit 6 is going to be about industrialization. And so when you talk about industrialization, you have to talk about what was going on beforehand. So if you look at the first one, it says, the Industrial Revolution spread from Great Britain to the continent, where the state played a greater role in promoting industry. So what you can do for context about industrialization is you could talk about what life was like before industrialization took place. You could talk about the family economy. You could talk about how the domestic system was the main way in which goods were produced. People made products in their home, going around the guild system. Sometimes there were machines, but they were operated by human power. Eventually, people like James Watt came up with new inventions, which led to the factory system and fossil fuels as a power source, and then that led to industrialization. You could talk about Britain being the first one because of political reforms that they had made about the Glorious Revolution, which protected private property and gave greater participation to the citizens in government. You could, if you were talking about industrialization on the continent, you could talk about how people followed Britain's example, but were maybe a little different in that the government was much more involved, whereas Britain was mostly done by private initiative. So basically, contextualization, I would talk about what life was like before industrialization took place and then lead into how industrialization happened. Daily life, right? The context here, daily life in the 19th century is profoundly impacted by industrialization, the development of class consciousness, which leads to working class and middle class attitudes and culture. How about urbanization and the effects on that has on how people live, and then the changing dynamic of the family, going from a unit that was the center of production to being split by work to being broken apart, where men are going to go off to work, women will stay in the home, children will go off to public schools. So if you're talking about daily life in the 19th century, you can talk about industrialization and how it led to these changes that we are going to see. And then the last thing that they talk about here are the political reforms that take place during this time period. And again, you could talk about early industrial problems. You might want to talk specifically about urbanization and the overcrowding, unsanitary conditions it produces. You might want to talk about early industrial labor and how dangerous and poorly paid the workers were. You may want to talk about for context, you may want to talk about how work and home become separate. And so women, especially in the middle class, are going to look for avenues for participation and a life outside of the home. All of these things you could establish as context and then write about the particular topic that you're going to see there. It would not surprise me to see something about industrialization on the 5-document DBQ. I could see that happening. Missy is biting the headphones. Okay. Now let's look at the causation. And basically this is real simple, and I don't really think I need to say too much about it. What were the causes of industrialization? Right? What are the effects? That's what you want to talk about. What led to industrialization, what effects that they had. And I feel like I've already said these things, so I'm not going to do it again, but you can see what's going on. And so there are basically 3 main ideas in this Unit 6. The causes and the effects of industrialization, the life of people living in these new urban societies and how that represents a change from the past, and then the reforms that are created by governments dealing with pressures from the new industrial world that is created. All right, so that's it for this. This is a really short video. After this, we're going to move on to Unit 7. We're going to look at the culture of the 19th century. Specifically, we'll look at how science changes. We'll look at how art changes. We'll look at, oh, there's one other thing, nationalism. and the effect that it has. And so basically, it is the last unit that we talked about with a little bit of more nationalism in there as well, before we started doing distance learning. So until then, I will talk to you guys later.